The fireflies danced their perpetual dance against the background of silent jungle. The scene of sawmill and trees stared back at me with a knowing and abstruse smile, shifty amid its glimmering loveliness, and I could hear the river. The dankness of rotting leaves and the vegetable reek of black water came to my senses. A midnight chilliness tingled in the air. I lay back once more, and after a while a soothing restfulness came over me, so that I was in no doubt that at last sleep was near. I tried to resign myself to the feeling, relaxing physically and mentally, but to no avail. I would imagine I was asleep, but would know that it was only a belief into which I had wishfully lulled myself. Thoughts would continue to weave unending patterns in my head. Now and then Jessie's distorted features drifted fearfully into the blackness behind my closed eyes, and I would sigh and fidget about. Presently, the horror began. I became aware of a musky smell. It was not the river or the jungle. At first I thought it might be a residue of some perfume on a garment in the women's room, but the next instant I knew it could not be so. There was a rankness in it, and this rankness grew stronger. I lay still, frowning up at the roof. I tried to convince myself that it must be my imagination again, playing a trick on me. But the conviction refused to take root. The smell persisted. Could it be some kind of incense that one of the men in the lodges was burning? No, I felt sure that it was not incense. There was an animal quality about it. That goatish reek could not be associated with incense. It baffled me completely. I could not identify the thing no matter how I tried. I sat up and looked slowly around. The hammock rope creaked, and the frog was chirruping again. The smell persisted. I felt the need for a cigarette, but feared the smoke would drift into the open windows and disturb Jessie and her mother. I turned my head and glanced in at them. The hammock creaked again, and I uttered a whispered curse. The smell grew stronger. Again I felt impelled to glance in at the window. I did so, and this time my gaze steadied. Something moved in the space between the two beds, something grey and of no definite shape. A humped shadow mass that settled out of sight on the floor. This was a night I'd never forget. In the story of my bones and my flute. Mrs. Nevinson began to move restlessly in her sleep. I could hear her sigh. Jessie slept on peacefully. I remained where I was, my gaze on the space between the two beds. My heart seemed to beat at a distance, perhaps amidst the shrubs by the river's edge, where that frog was chirruping now in leisurely but steady insistence. I felt the moist gaze of the moonlit jungle upon my tingling back, as though out of their aloof silence the dense walls of foliage were trying to communicate a warning to me, to rush away back to my room, to leave this spot as quickly as I could, and not pry further into matters that were beyond this known scheme of living. But I did not move, determined to witness what was happening in the room. The strange smell gradually faded, but I noticed that Mrs. Nevinson's restlessness was increasing. After a moment I heard her moan. Her face kept wincing in a troubled manner. More than once her hands would pluck feverishly at her hair, or she would make a dismissing gesture as though to ward off some unseen insect that might have been worrying her. This gesture would be accompanied by a look of irritation or fear. There was an air about her, even in her sleeping condition, of resistance, of determination. She impressed me as keeping off from her person some unpleasant influence or undesirable presence not visible to me. Soon her body moved without cessation, wriggling and twisting, her arms flailing about, and her breath coming in labored grunts. There was something tortured and desperate about her efforts, as though she were wrestling with a powerful unseen opponent. When at length her frenzy had reached to such a pitch that her body began to arch and heave and seemed in danger of tumbling off the bed, she opened her eyes with a gasping cry, then with a whimper buried her face into her pillow and grew still, though her back kept heaving from her recent exertions. I heard her husband called out sleepily from his room and saw her raise her head as she replied, "The nightmare again, Ralph." Throughout all this, Jessie had slept on without moving. Even the voices of her parents had not disturbed her. Stiff and chilled, I sat where I was, unable to take my gaze off the two women. Intuitively, I seemed to know that the crisis was not yet over. There was something wrong still, and even though I watched Mrs. Nevinson's breathing grow normal and knew that she had sunk once again into a restful slumber, I could sense a tenseness in the atmosphere, a waiting. The air seemed to contain a malignant vibration. I began to be aware again of that devilish smell. It grew stronger and stronger, and the air around me seemed to thicken with a pall of evil. I felt a panicky restlessness coming alive within me, and again there was that tingling down my back. The ether seemed alive with baffling apprehensions. The frog had stopped chirruping, but the very absence of its chirruping appeared to signify something important and urgent. The night was livid with insect chirring, a livid, high-pitched rawness that, with the chafing beat of the petter engine, seemed to bruise my consciousness into a numbed, bleeding silence. I felt as though I were poised within a bubble of buzzing incoherence. Watching, I saw the thing happen. In the space between the two beds, a humped greyness slowly began to rise into view. I jerked my head to make sure that it was not my fancy, that it was not a hallucination, and I knew that it was not. I was actually seeing it. It rose in a shapeless, greyish-brown, misty mass, as though a damp cloud of dust had been spirited up from the floor. But there was too much deliberation in this thing for it to be dust. Leisurely it began to heave itself, almost with a human wriggle over Jessie's bed. Then I saw it gradually subside and vanish into the girl's sleeping form. As you may recall, I hinted in my prefatory remarks that it was my intention to narrate these occurrences in chronological order, and that it was only in deference to the wishes of Mr. and Mrs. Nevinson and Jessie that I did not publish my bare diary notes, but decided instead to amalgamate them into this narrative form. I'm a great stickler for tidiness and routine, and even at the risk of being somewhat annoying, I must once again defer touching on the matter of my theory, in the detailed form promised, until I have recorded for your benefit what Mrs. Nevinson told us the following morning, that is, on Monday, concerning her dream of the night before. She said, "Something new has come into it, though I don't know that it matters much. Everything seemed like the nights before, except that suddenly I found myself breaking off from the track and pushing my way through the jungle. The flute player seemed to have left the track and taken to the jungle, and I had to follow him. The bush was thick, but I managed to go through it somehow, and then that bony hand gripped my arm and whispered. It said this time, 8 nights, and then to join us." And for some reason I began to smell something musky and queer near me, and I could have sworn I saw 2 greyish, furry hands reaching out for my throat. After that, I woke up. It was a significant development in the story of my bones and my flute.